So I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about the Beaufort Lagoon system. This is not a data talk. I don't know if I have any data in here. But it's about these sort of connections with management stakeholders on the North Slope. So I wanted to start out by just sort of recognizing the sort of the core team, if you will, that together moves this LTER forward, makes it sort of what it is. There are 13 PIs, 8 different academic institutions involved, couple of full-time project people. That's Nathan McTighe and Haley Plum. Our information manager, Tim Whitaker, who was also a PI on the project, but does a fantastic job, information side of things. And then Katie Gavinas, who is part-time on the project as our education coordinator, and also is part-time education coordinator for the Northern Gulf, the NGA LTER. So that's sort of a nice synergy between those. And just this figure right here, or this picture on the right, is to remind me to recognize Ken. I co-directed this project with Ken Dunton, but he's the lead PI on the project, and in many ways the heart and soul of the project. So he's here with a couple of new kids in Kaktovik, one of the places we work. Okay, so Evelyn did a great job earlier of covering the broader sort of how the network is put together, and I won't spend any more time on that. But some specifics about BLE. We joined the network in 2017. Our first field work began in 2018, and we just had our renewal for our second round start in 2023. So, but like many sites, sort of our LTER is built on longer term stuff that we were, to some degree, on longer term stuff that we were already doing. So we're not entirely starting from scratch. If we can boil what we do down into one question, which is difficult for an LTER, but this is what it would be: how do interactions between terrestrial inputs, sea ice dynamics, and ocean exchange influence Arctic lagoon ecosystems over seasonal to multi-decadal timeframes? There's obviously a huge climate change overlay on this in the Arctic, which is warming 4 times faster than the globe, the sort of global average. So there's lots going on there. In terms of terrestrial inputs, so we focus on coastal erosion, watershed runoff, groundwater inputs, and ecosystem properties. Among them are sort of the many forms of biological production, community composition, species diversity, things like that, food web relationships, and biogeochemical cycling. We work at, or sort of unique among LTERs in having working out of multiple locations. We work on the western, central, and eastern Beaufort Sea coast out of 3 separate communities, if you will, that are separated by vast areas of natural landscape that are largely untouched. And we have to do everything we do in a very coordinated way because of the location that we're at. So we go up as a group 3 times a year in April, June, and August to sample basically the late winter, the ice breakup period after the big spring freshet has happened and all the runoffs sort of largely entered the Beaufort Sea waters. And then we go up in the ice-free season in the summertime, when the lights are on and it's warmed up a little bit. And we have, a whole suite of things that we do: in situ sensors, remote sensing work, lots of seasonal measurements during those seasonal trips, and then some modeling components. I'm not going to get into the specifics of these core program measurements, but Evelyn mentioned earlier that all these LTERs have sort of unique aspects of what they measure, and also sort of for our program, these are things that we do regardless of who's involved. Over time, these things are done, but in the sort of physical, chemical, biological realm. So lots of sort of threads of data. Some of those attached to sensors that are sitting out and measuring every hour year round, and lots of other things that are done during our field trips. Okay, so that was a quick overview of the LTER. I want to spend most of my time talking about this link with I was reluctant to say with local managers, because I think it's stakeholders in management, including in some cases like the communities that live on the North Slope. They're largely Native Alaskan Inupiat communities, which have vast sort of tracts of tribal lands that they are the stewards of. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, which and the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, which we, of course, sort of fits easily into that sort of management framework. And then Hillcorp, which and other oil companies in the North Slope, which are clearly not land managers, but have a huge stake in land management and understanding the impacts they're having on the environment. So yeah, those are the three I'm going to sort of highlight and talk about more. But I'm going to start with the local communities. And one thing I wanted to sort of highlight in a way is we engage with these communities a lot. We work out of their small villages. And we work with them in many ways. But one thing that we recognized early on and have been sort of trying to acknowledge and also work through is that we have a whole bunch of things we do scientifically, some of which overlap and intersect with their local concerns and some don't. And that's okay, right? There's lots of reasons that we're up there doing what we do. But from their perspective, their health is at the top of their list, threats to infrastructure, concerns about limited economic opportunities and subsistence and cultural concerns and related to other people showing up on the North Slope, but also climate change having a huge impact on their environment. So we intersect there in a way. In terms of the infrastructure and work we do on coastal erosion, there's a real connection there. In terms of the food web and sort of productivity and understanding how the ecosystem works from a particularly food web and how it trickles up to higher trophic levels, they become very interested in that. So there's an intersection there. One of the ways that we have formalized our connections and the back and forth that we do with communities is we've worked to establish what are sort of referred to as TK panels, traditional knowledge panels, to both share what we're learning and what we're doing, but also do a lot of listening. That's how we learn about the concerns of the community. That's how we learn what they have to say about providing input on what they know about the environment, about what they know about the places that we're working, or maybe we should work, or the things that we should be thinking about. So there's a lot of back and forth there. And that was started as a partnership with the Bureau of Ocean and Energy Management, and has sort of taken on a life of its own now, which is great. Right. So as I mentioned, another one of our partners is the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, both more broadly on the North Slope and in particular as it relates to the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, which one of our sites is in a village which is in the refuge. Yeah, so we interface with them in terms of science. For instance, I recently completed a project focusing on groundwater inputs to some of the lagoons in the refuge, and there are refuge scientists that were part of that project that were, participated in field work, published with us, things like that. They do a ton with us in terms of education. We benefit from that. They benefit from that. The relationship between fish and wildlife and local communities is often strained, and this helps everyone get to know each other better. That's sort of what these sort of pictures represent some of the different things we do that interface with fish and wildlife. And then sort of on another, this third leg, if you will, having to do with sort of interfacing with oil communities. One of the things that was started long before the LTER was established was work in this area called the Boulder Patch, which is near some of the major oil areas where oil and gas development was first started. And Ken was involved in that from the beginning. And the idea there was that as this development was happening, there are these sensitive ecosystems. These happen to be rocky ecosystems that have kelp communities on them. That there needed to be baseline data, needed to be understanding of sort of those how those ecosystems work over time, but also how potentially the building of rural islands, like you can see here, this whole thing I'm sort of circling here. I don't know if you can see it or not, but this stuff that looks not quite natural is indeed not natural. That's all man-made there. But anyways, there's sort of a relationship there that is both us understanding and learning about the system, but also providing the backdrop for understanding if there are impacts that are taking place up there related to oil and gas. Okay, so some key points here that I want to emphasize in the last few minutes of this is, first of all, just to sort of summarize, right? BLE, our work on coastal erosion, water quality, and food webs, particularly at sort of higher trophic levels, fish and birds, mesh really well with local interests of these largely Inupiat communities. One thing I didn't mention, well, I'll mention in a minute, but yeah, so that's one way that we sort of interact with them. Fish and wildlife has those same sort of co-interests, but are more cued into the data streams themselves that we generate, and as opposed to the sort of looser connections. I guess one example I wanted to bring up really recently that happened, last summer, the people from the communities came to us and said, hey, well, they showed it. They took us down to the beach and they're showing us dead fish. There obviously been a fish kill. They described larger fish kills that had, like other stuff that happened over the summer, and they were asking us, why, what's going on, and what, we have these sensors out in the lagoons. They're lagoons, the very lagoons that we were standing on the shores of, and we pulled those data up, for their sort of annual downloads, and sure enough, there were these low oxygen events that had happened, no ionoxic events that had happened in the bottom waters of the lagoons. And so that was sort of a really interesting, very proximate, example of how the data that we're gathering could be useful to the local communities, not just our broader sort of climate change concerns and things like that. So, okay. Yeah, so the third bullet here is that BLE, our work focusing on the sort of abundance and species composition of benthic communities in the Boulder Patch area, but also up and down the coast now is of particular interest to the oil and gas companies working in the region, who obviously have a big environmental footprint, but are also working to impact the environment, to try not to impact the environment any more than they have to as they extract oil and gas. So there's a relationship there that's valuable. And then the last thing I wanted to say here is that for all three of these, it's not just about the long-term data. And I think, well, I know, Alan brought this up earlier in his talk when he mentioned trusted and sustained partnerships. But yeah, these long-term partnerships are extremely valuable. And that's both in terms of trust and sort of ease of the working relationship, but also because LTERs are long-term projects, it allows for these synergies to develop and evolve over time. And one example of that is just, right, we have a shorter term project, and often we'll have conversations with, say, a local community, and they'll say, oh, we're really interested in this or that, and then, and that's great, we've learned something, but we can't do anything about it. But over these longer sort of cycles that LTERs go through, and as we go put in renewals, we can actually think about that and build new things in. And one of the two things we built into the new the 2023 re-up of the LTER was more higher trophic level work and actually contaminant work, mercury work, and other contaminants in fish and some of the bird species that they are consuming. So we were able to be responsive because of the long-term nature of the project to these community concerns, and not just sort of nod our heads and say, yeah, we understand. And so I'll sort of I'm out of time. I'll end it there. Yeah, it's not just the data, it's the relationships, and just the long-term nature of these projects that leads to being able to sort of pursue things in these partnerships that you couldn't in an approximate sense. So yeah, and the last thing is just, I definitely want to acknowledge the National Science Foundation Office of Polar Programs as the sort of the funding source for our LTER, and these other sort of logistics components that are important. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Evelyn. Thanks, everybody. Yeah, so the talk I'm going to give today is going to build on information from the Florida Coastal Everglades Long-Term Ecological Research Program, as well as our partnership with the Everglades National Park. For those of you that might not know, the Everglades is the world's largest restoration effort ever attempted, and our LTER site resides within the national park boundary. So here's an aerial image of, or an image from atop of an eddy flux tower along Shark River Slough in a mangrove forest, taken by one of our graduate students, Luke Lamb-Wotan. And yes, we are also funded by the National Science Foundation through multiple cooperative agreements. And we are in our 23rd year, soon to have 24 years of long-term research. I also just want to acknowledge that the Florida Coastal Everglades is being conducted, its research is being conducted on the lands that have been cared for by innumerable generations of original people. And today's peoples are the indigenous sovereignties known as the Miccosukee Tribe of Indians of Florida, the Seminole Tribe of Indians of Florida, and other sovereign Miccosukee Seminole nations. The 2009 U.S. apology to Native peoples inaugurated an American context of reconciliation, which is an opportunity for healing, collaboration, and environmental conservation. And we are actively working to build endurable collaborations with Miccosukee and Seminole. And if you care to look at our acknowledgement video from the FCLTR, there's a hyperlink in the slides that I'm happy to share. So in our LTER site in the Florida Coastal Everglades, as well as other LTER sites, we look at the role of disturbance, which we can define here as events and their impacts that as processes can transform the structure of social ecological systems and their responses to any given drivers. And this is work that's been developed over decades of long-term research, starting with Deb Peters, Nancy Grimm, and Evelyn Geiser, our former lead principal investigator. We're also very interested in understanding legacies, as other LTER sites are as well, the informational responses and material structures from prior disturbances that constrain how the system responds to subsequent drivers, and that influences the capacity of the system. So basically, systems have memory of the past. And through collaborations across the entire LTER network, we developed an extension of the Odom's classic ecosystem development theory, which says that older systems are more internally driven and more stable and have more stores of carbon. And so they reach this homeostatic plateau. But we know that systems are increasingly more disturbed, and that disturbance can occur at any state of development. And those disturbances outlined here as press pulse regimes can either be increasing, maintaining stationarity, or be non-stationary, causing systems to move in trajectories that are either developing, stabilized apparently, or declining. So in the Florida Coastal Everglades Long-Term Ecological Research Program, we study these aspects of disturbance and their legacies along two dominant drainages, Shark River Slough, which is denoted as SRS, which is one of the major drainages receiving restorative fresh water from the Central Everglades through the Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan. And these pulses of fresh water are coming in really rapidly, as I'll show you in a few slides. And those pulses of freshwater are mixing with pulses of marine water, which are increasing from sea level rise and storm surges. We also have a smaller drainage that's called Taylor Slough Panhandle towards the east, and it is not as high in its productivity, and it receives less amounts of freshwater pulses and is more protected from increases of marine water. However, it has some pretty strong groundwater pulse upwellings seasonally. So our sites are distributed along freshwater marshes and marl prairies, where the research I'll talk to you about in a few slides will focus on, and then mangrove forests and estuaries, as well as seagrass meadows throughout Florida Bay. We are an extremely phosphorus limited ecosystem, and so phosphorus is an important part of restoration, as well as the responses to restoration and disturbances. So here's just some quick videos that we took of our sites to give you sort of a sense of the landscape, because it's a very flat landscape. It's best viewed from either above or below the water. And we have freshwater marshes, as mentioned, agricultural and urban lands that I won't speak about today, ecotone wetlands that integrate marsh and mangrove, salt and fresh water, coastal mangrove forests, and then seagrass meadows in Florida Bay. So the Everglades is being rapidly restored with a lot of fresh water. So this is a picture of the northern boundary of Everglades National Park looking north. And this is US 41 or Tamiami Trail, where bridges have been built recently in the last decade. And lots of fresh water is being pushed into the southern Everglades, creating a real opportunity to understand the responses to both restored hydrology, as well as how that interacts with the legacy of more than 100 years of reduced fresh water in this landscape. So basically, the story is water is increasing everywhere. So this plot, we've got the map on the left, and these are our water level plots from USGS. Eden, it's the Everglades Depth Estimation Network. So in partnership with USGS, we have real-time water level data gridded throughout the landscape, and we see increases over time from 2000 to 2022, the duration of our long-term research program, in our marshes, ecotone wetlands, coastal mangroves, and even seagrasses from sea level rise throughout our two drainages. But that's a lot of landscape to cover in one talk, and I want to focus in what's called Northeast Shark River Slough, in a partnership that we've had with the National Park Service since about 2006, but really consistently since about 2012. And this is an area that has historically dried down and is now being rapidly rehydrated. And this map shows 65 or so sites that are distributed. This is Tamiami Trail to the north, and areas throughout the Northeast Shark River Slough that are short hydroperiod and long hydroperiod wetlands. And these sites have been sampled over the time for various attributes of chemistry. And what we did is we composited all of those chemical attributes from soil, water, plant, periphyton, flock, and grouped them to show how they clustered in space. And what you see is that there's 4 clusters, color-coded, and a lot of clustering of our sites along the Tamiami Trail, which is a known hotspot of legacy phosphorus. So not everything clustered by distance from the L29 canal or the Tamiami Trail. So we had 2 prominent clusterings of what we call Chem 1 and Chem 2, the blue and the green that are clustering along the trail. And then Chem 3 is in red, that's more distributed. And Chem 4 is in yellow, which is in a shorter hydroperiod, more marl prairie habitat. What also happens in the Everglades is we have wildfires. Sometimes they're catastrophic wildfires, and we have a lot of prescribed fires. And so the same map just overlaying some recent fires that have occurred in the region during our sampling period and the percent areas of sites that have been burned from those fires. And so sites that are closer to this Marl Prairie area that's drier, they've actually not been burning very frequently in 2015 and 2018, but then 23% of those areas were burned through prescribed management from the Park Service. And in contrast, areas that were close to Tamiami Trail that had a lot of dry down prior to some increasing restoration efforts had some wildfires as well as prescribed fires that were burning a lot of area in that region. So just several slides of quick data. Basically, we're restoring fresh water using a established nutrient criterion, federally mandated nutrient criterion for the Everglades, which is 10 parts per billion or 10 micrograms per liter. And the water that enters into Everglades National Park that we manage or that we measure through the L29 canal, we're meeting those levels of nutrients. But once it enters in, it's interacting with legacy forms of phosphorus to cause certain areas close to the canal to be elevated in surface water TP. So you can see here that pre-2015, 2018, we started to increase in surface water TP, which was coincident with when water levels were starting to increase rapidly. And then by 2021, we get this really large wedge of high TP from surface water interacting with these legacy high P sites that were nearest to the road. So those soil phosphorus actually also maintained high P closest to Tamiami Trail, but it didn't respond yet to changes in hydrology or even yet to any of that fire that I talked about earlier. So I'm gonna just say quickly that we're seeing big changes in vegetation. Mostly we're getting less vegetation associated with short hydroperiod wetlands and more vegetation increases with long hydroperiod wetlands. So we're getting more cattails and we're getting more sawgrass, which we want sawgrass. It's our ridge forming vegetation. But we are losing certain species that are more adapted to short hydroperiods, and that's an issue of concern for biodiversity. So really what we're doing in this landscape is trying to couple hydrology and fire. And so the Water Management District and the Army Corps manage the water that comes into the park. The Park Service manages fire and prescription fires. And we've got this nice recipe for understanding how these two management strategies are playing out with respect to phosphorus and vegetation communities, among other things. And just to note that in the areas where there was increases in vegetation from when water was increasing concomitantly, we also had some high percent areas of burn. So we know that fire releases bound phosphorus and allows it to be recycled. And so that is an area of continued investigation for both our LTER sites and the Park Service. Lastly, I just want to give you like a big blowout of what's happening in the landscape with fire history. So wildfires and prescribed fires are changing in their percent area. So we've had less wildfires because of water management and because of fire management over the last 50, 60 years. And we are seeing an increase, a rapid increase in prescribed fires because the Park Service is doing a lot of controlled burning. And then this map, which is maybe difficult to see, is parsing out different hydroperiod wetlands. So we've got our intermediate hydroperiod to the west, the long hydroperiod along Shark River Slough in the center, and then the short hydroperiod to the east along Taylor Slough. And then overlaying underneath that is the time since last fire, which will become important here in a moment. My former postdoc, Andrea, pulled together, these are more than 500 data sets from both long-term ecological research site data and also from Park Service data and other projects, and found that really soil carbon and nitrogen increase with hydroperiod, not with fire. But soil phosphorus is highest when fire has been recent within the last 2 to 15 years. But if it's reoccurring every year, you lose that P. If you have fire that doesn't come in for 4 decades, you also begin to lose that P, presumably through shift in vegetation communities. So last slide is just to say that in order to manage phosphorus, we need to manage hydrology and fire, and that we're trying to do capture sort of a sweet spot of keeping that bound phosphorus in the soil around 600 micrograms per liter or less, micrograms per gram or less, and hydroperiod being days with inundation above 300 to capture this ideal classic ridge and slough vegetation of our ridge and slough wetlands. So with sawgrass ridges and with Eleocharis or spike rush in our sloughs, among other slough dominant species. So I just wanted to say thank you to this entire group of networks that have enabled this long-term research, and I hope I didn't go over.
Thanks so much, John, for your awesome presentation. Great examples coming from these sites. And does anybody have any pressing questions?
I have one quick one.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah, so the sort of more concentrated phosphorus near the road, is that related to just trapping associated with the road itself, or does it have to do with runoff? Why?
Yeah, a lot of it, it's a great question, and I didn't articulate it. The clustering that we saw between groups 1 and groups 2 at the edge of the road has to do with where culverts have been and pre-bridge culverts. So that concentrates phosphorus loading into these hotspot areas that then create these swales of what we call them artificial tree islands that are they're mounded up areas that also became drier, and so the elevation is higher even though it's closest to the canal, and so it becomes like a willow tree rich dense vegetation kind of habitat.